When was the last time you typed out a caption, stared at it, and then just deleted the whole thing? Not because it wasn't good enough, but because something inside you said, I don't want to do this anymore. The moment was beautiful, but turning it into content felt exhausting, so you closed the app and kept it to yourself. Think about it. How many times have you lived a moment twice? Once when it actually happened, and once when you were deciding how to describe it online. That split second where you're standing in front of something beautiful, but instead of just feeling it, you're already thinking about the caption, already imagining the angle, already anticipating how people will react. Psychologists call this self-monitoring. It's when the presence of an audience, even an imagined one, changes not just how you express emotions, but how you experience them in the first place. And some people, the ones who've stopped posting, they felt that shift happening. They noticed that their happiness started needing announcement, that their pain needed to be softened before it could be shared, that even their growth had to be proven, documented, made visible. And they didn't like what that was doing to them, so they stopped. Not because they're detached, not because they don't have anything worth sharing, but because they wanted their life back, the unnarrated version, the one that doesn't require validation to feel real. Now, this isn't about being superior. It's not about looking down on people who do post. It's about understanding a specific psychological tension that some people feel more intensely than others. Because social media, whether we admit it or not, quietly reshapes how we relate to our own lives. Studies on reward systems show that unpredictable social feedback, likes, comments, reactions, activates the brain's dopamine pathways in a way that's eerily similar to variable reward conditioning. It's the same mechanism that makes slot machines addictive. You post something, you wait, you check. Sometimes you get a flood of validation, sometimes you get silence, and your brain starts craving that reaction more than it craves the actual expression. Some people notice this happening to them. They notice that they're no longer sharing because they want to. They're sharing because they're waiting for a response. And that realization, that's when they start pulling back. Because here's the thing. When you grow up needing external validation, when you learn early that your worth is determined by how others perceive you, social media becomes dangerous. Not in an obvious way, but in a slow, creeping way. You start curating yourself without realizing it. You start performing even when no one asked you to. You begin to shape your identity around what gets engagement, what gets seen, what gets remembered. And over time, you lose track of who you actually are underneath all that curation. The people who stop posting, a lot of them are recovering from that. They're people who once tied their self-worth to visibility and realized it was exhausting. So they chose privacy, not as a rejection of connection, but as a return to themselves. But let's be honest, there's another layer here, one that people don't talk about as much. For some people, not posting is a boundary shaped by experience. Maybe they once shared something deeply personal and watched it flatten into misunderstanding. Maybe their vulnerability became gossip. Maybe their joy attracted comparison instead of connection. Or maybe, and this one's subtle, maybe they posted their way through a hard time and realized that performing their healing for an audience actually delayed their healing. Because when you document your growth, you freeze it. You turn it into a narrative that has to make sense. And sometimes, real growth doesn't make sense. Sometimes it's messy and contradictory and private, and it doesn't need witnesses. Psychologists have a term for this: selective exposure. It's when you consciously decide where your emotions are allowed to exist. And for people who don't post, their emotions exist in conversations, in journals, in therapy, in quiet moments with people they trust. But not online. Not where their feelings can be screenshotted, misinterpreted, or turned into someone else's content. That's not withdrawal, that's discernment. And there's a difference. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Because the people who don't post, they're often observers. They scroll, they watch, they see how people curate themselves, how confidence appears strongest right before collapse, how silence follows vulnerability, how approval comes and goes without any real pattern. They notice how quickly celebration turns into comparison, how fast support turns into judgment. And they think to themselves, I don't want to play this game. Not because they're above it, but because they've seen what it does to people. They've watched friends become anxious about their follower count. They've seen relationships perform happiness while falling apart privately. They've noticed how exhausting it is to maintain an online version of yourself that's always slightly better, slightly more together, slightly more interesting than the real you. And they decided that exhaustion wasn't worth it. But here's the paradox, and this is where the psychology gets complicated, because even the people who choose not to post still feel the absence. They still notice when their birthday passes and fewer people remember because they weren't reminded by an algorithm. They still feel invisible sometimes, not because they need attention, but because they're human, and humans need to be seen. Just not constantly, just not performatively. They want to be remembered without having to broadcast their existence. They want connection without curation. And that's a hard balance to find in a world where visibility has become the default currency of relevance. There's also something deeper going on, something about identity. When you post regularly, you create a version of yourself that exists outside of you, a digital self. And that self doesn't update when you do. It stays frozen in whatever you last shared. For people who are constantly evolving internally, people whose beliefs shift, whose values refine, whose sense of self reorganizes regularly, that frozen version feels like a trap. They don't want yesterday's version of themselves speaking for who they are today. So instead of posting their evolution, they just let it happen quietly, privately, without explanation. They grow without documenting it. And there's something deeply mature about that, because it means their sense of self is built internally, not mirrored back at them by strangers. But let's not romanticize this too much, because there's a cost to silence. People forget, not because they don't care, but because out of sight really does mean out of mind in the digital age. Opportunities pass by quietly, friendships drift. You become easy to overlook, not because you lack value, but because you refused visibility. And sometimes, late at night, when you're scrolling through everyone else's highlight reel, you wonder if staying quiet was the right choice. You wonder if maybe you're missing out, if maybe your life looks emptier than it actually is because no one can see it. That doubt is real, and it's okay to feel it, because choosing not to post doesn't mean you're completely at peace with invisibility. It just means you've decided peace is worth more than presence. Here's what's fascinating, though. The people who don't post, they're often the most emotionally independent. Not because they don't feel deeply, they do, but because they've learned to validate their own experiences without needing external confirmation. They don't measure the quality of a moment by how many people reacted to it. They don't need their joy to be witnessed to feel real. They've built a relationship with themselves that doesn't require an audience. And that kind of self-trust, that's rare. That's something most people are still searching for. Because in a culture that equates existence with exposure, the ability to live fully without documentation is almost countercultural. It's a quiet rebellion. Not loud, not performative, just steady. But even with all that strength, there are moments of doubt. Moments when you wonder if you're being forgotten, if your silence is being interpreted as disinterest, if people assume you're not doing anything important because they can't see it. And that hurts. Not in a dramatic way, but in a slow, accumulating way. Because you're still human. You still want to matter. You just don't want to have to prove it constantly. You don't want your worth to be determined by engagement metrics. You don't want your identity reduced to content. And so, you stay quiet. Even when it's lonely, even when it's misunderstood. Because you've learned something that's hard to unlearn. That constant visibility comes with constant noise. And you need the silence to hear yourself think. There's also a practical element people overlook. Posting creates permanence. Every photo, every caption, every opinion you share becomes a record. And records don't age well. They don't account for growth. They don't leave room for contradiction. People will scroll back years and hold you accountable for a version of yourself you've outgrown. For people who are constantly evolving, who are willing to change their minds, who don't want their past selves defining their present, that permanence feels suffocating. So they opt out. They live in the present without leaving a trail. They let themselves change without having to explain why. And there's a freedom in that, a freedom that people who post constantly might never fully understand. Now, does this mean people who don't post are healthier? No. Does it mean they're more authentic? Not necessarily. Because here's the truth. Some people don't post because they're genuinely at peace with themselves. And some people don't post because they're terrified of judgment. Some people stay quiet because they've found meaning offline. And some people stay quiet because they're hiding. Both can be true, and that's okay. Because the psychology of silence isn't one size fits all. It's layered, it's nuanced, it's as complex as the people living it. But here's what we can say with confidence. In a world that constantly pressures us to share, to perform, to prove our existence through visibility, choosing not to post is an act of resistance. It's saying, I don't need your permission to matter. I don't need your validation to be real. My life is happening whether you see it or not. And that takes courage. Quiet courage. The kind that doesn't get celebrated because it's invisible by design. So if you're someone who doesn't post, if you've quietly stepped back from the performance, if you've chosen privacy over presence, know this: your silence isn't emptiness. It's not lack of ambition or fear of being seen. It's a choice, a deliberate, thoughtful choice to protect your peace, to preserve your authenticity, to live without narration. And that choice is valid, even when it's lonely, even when it's misunderstood, even when people forget you're there. Because you know something they're still learning, that the most meaningful moments don't need to be uploaded, that the deepest connections don't require an audience, that some stories are meant to be lived fully, quietly, and entirely for yourself. And maybe that's the most honest way to exist. Not performing happiness, not curating growth, not documenting every milestone, just living, fully, privately, without needing the world to witness it. Because you were never meant to be content. You were meant to be whole. And wholeness doesn't need a platform. It just needs you, showing up, quietly, consistently, for yourself. That's not detachment, that's freedom. And if that resonates with you, if you felt this tension between visibility and authenticity, you're not alone. Even in your silence, you're not alone. And maybe that's enough.